Welcome to Inside Pinch Recording. Today we're going to be focusing on drum sound. So I'm going to show you how I go about recording drums. Now, every time I record drums, there are some things that pretty much are consistent, but there are a lot of things that change depending on the scenario, the type of music, the room that we're recording in, the type of drums we're using. All those types of things really play into the way we're going to approach miking the drums. What we're going to be focusing on today is sort of a general drum sound for, we'll say, rock. The biggest difference is if I'm recording rock versus jazz, those types of things will change a lot. But we're gonna actually go through the mic choices that I choose and why. We're gonna go through the drums that we're using, the drummer that we're using, the room that we're in. We're gonna go through the preamps that we use, the EQ, the compression, everything. We're gonna go through everything about recording drums here at Pinch Recording. The most important thing about recording drums is having a good drummer. If you have a bad drummer, you're never going to get a good drum sound. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be working with a good friend of mine, Pablo Lushans. He's a partner here at Pinch Recording. He's a Berkeley grad. He's a sick drummer, and he's agreed to work with us as far as just playing drums for half an hour while I show you how we get drum sounds. The second thing that I think is the most important is the room that you're recording the drums in. So there's a lot of different styles of drums that you can do. You can do drums in a really small dry room. You can do drums in a huge, Abbey Roads type room. What we have here at Pinch Recording is something I really pride myself on, is the live room itself has a wonderful sound, and we've worked really hard to get the sound really good. Drums like big rooms, especially if you're talking about like a rock sound or even jazz. I mean, really, drums just like to breathe because they're loud. They're a loud instrument. So when we were looking at studio spaces, we wanted to make sure we had a nice live room that had really tall ceilings. So when we found this space, it was perfect. So we have 22-foot ceilings here. We've done a lot of treatment to the room to make sure that it sounds the way we want it to sound. So we have a huge ceiling of wood. It's all wood. And then here we have another surface of wood, which has different levels of wood paneling. So the sound bounces off of it in different ways. It diffuses. Then we also have this 22-foot wall of brick. Brick I love for drums because it can give you a real live slap sound to the drums, and it has a natural character. And then we have all these diffusers that we've custom built for the room itself. So we have diffusers all over. Diffusers help to just spread the sound out, make sure that we're not getting any cancellation in sounds. And then I actually put these blankets up semi-recently to deaden the room a little bit, give it a little bit more of a short feel to it. And we put this rug down as well. If you take the rug out and take the blankets out, it's super live. But anyway, you can always be changing around. What I recommend is experiment with different things to try to get the room to sound the way you like it. We have other rooms here at Pinch that are really tight, small rooms, which sometimes is a really cool vibe for drums as well. But in this scenario, we're going to be using the live room just because I love showcasing the live room. You can get some really cool room drum sounds and ceiling mics and all that kind of stuff. So the third thing, the drummer, the room, the drums themselves. So today we're using Gretsch kit. This is actually sort of like a combination kit. It's not like a standard kit that you would get all in one. So we have a custom Gretsch kick drum. I think that's a 20-inch kick drum. One of my favorite kick drums. Then we have the two Gretsch toms. And we're actually using on the snare for this today is a Copperphonic, which has a really cool, deep, rich sound. I love this drum. And you want to make sure when you're going to record drums that the drums are tuned well, that the drums are in good condition, and that they sound good in the room. Now, Pablo and I have done a lot of work together. We've really tweaked everything so that it really sounds great in this room. So I'm already confident that the drums themselves sound good. Pablo spends hours and hours in here practicing all the time. So the drums are always ready to go. He's got beautiful cymbals. I think he's sponsored by Dream Cymbals, so we end up with a lot of Dream cymbals here. And the drums just have a gorgeous sound. These are very professional drums, and I highly recommend it. Obviously, if you're going to be recording something, you want the what you're recording to be high quality. Otherwise, if you're recording shitty drums, they're gonna sound shitty, right? If that's the vibe you're going for, like a shitty drum sound, trashy, then great. But for here, we're looking for a beautiful, rich, studio quality, rock sounding drums. Next, what we're gonna do is I'll go through the mic choices for you. Today, we're actually gonna be recording 13 mics. Some of them are room mics, some of them are close mics, some of them are overheads. There's a lot of different ways to record drums. In this scenario, we're using 13 mics, but sometimes I'll use 4 mics. Sometimes I'll use 2 microphones. It really depends on the vibe and what you're going after. Just because you're using 13 mics doesn't necessarily mean that the drums are gonna sound good, especially if you don't know what you're doing. You're better off, actually, if you don't know what you're doing, using 4 microphones or 2 microphones than using 13 mics and not having them work properly together. It's really an art and a balancing act to figuring out how you want to utilize the microphones, why you have 13 microphones, and what each microphone is adding to the sound of the drums. You have your pretty classic setup here, which you'll see on general drum setups as far as the mics and where they're located. So for the kick drum, we're going to be using an inside kick drum mic and an outside kick drum mic. So for the inside kick drum mic, I've been using this mic, and you know, I don't always use the same microphones for every time I record drums because it's mainly boring. If you're going to use the same mics every time, you're not experimenting, you have a very specific way you record everything every single time, it's going to not be exciting. So for me, every time I record drums, I like to try different microphones. Put one here, put one there, see what works, see what doesn't. Have fun with it because that's, for me, the reason I do recording is because it's fun and enjoyable. So this microphone is a Telefunken. It's an M82, I believe it's called. It's a dynamic mic, and it's you would think it would be this address from the side, but it's actually a front address. So the mic itself capsule is pointing this way. The reason I love these microphones is they have filters inside the microphone specific to kick drum. So I guess you could call this a kick drum microphone because it has the EQs that you traditionally do a lot of the times on the board or on your external EQs are built into the microphone. So this is going to scoop out a bell at probably, I don't know, between 200 and 500, something like that. And then the high boost is going to give you a little bit of attack on the maybe 5K range or up, which is, you know, a lot of the times your go-to sort of EQ. So I like this mic because a lot of times it's ready to go straight from the source. So with this, I'm gonna go inside the hole of the kick drum and, you know, probably go in, let's see, you can only get, the other thing about drums is it's an art form, just figuring out how to place all the microphones and not get in the drummer's way. But I'm gonna go inside the hole here, probably about 12 inches, and face it towards the batter. The inside kick drum mic, if you're using an inside and outside, this I'm going to be using mainly for the attack of the drum, more so than anything else. And then for the outside kick drum, I'm using a Neumann U87. I usually like to use large diaphragm condensers for the outside kick drum, but sometimes that changes. Sometimes I use dynamics. When I'm trying to get from the outside kick drum, a lot of times, it depends. If I'm doing a rock sound, I usually like the outside kick drum to be sort of like a saturated, crunchy, low end sound that I tuck in. If I'm doing a jazz session, it's going to be much cleaner. But for this particular setup, I'm using this Neumann U87, and I'm going to place this, and this might change. You know, a lot of times I'll place the mics, and once you get into the room, if they're out of phase or they're not sounding right, you can come back and kind of move it around a little bit. If you move a mic 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inches from where it was before, it can change the sound dramatically. I also have a pad on this microphone. I have a 10 dB pad. The reason I do that is because the SPL level from the kick drum is really high, and if you don't put the pad on, it can probably distort the capsule. So with this, I put the pad on, and I just kind of place it maybe about a foot away from the kick drum. And I'm not too concerned about the bleed of the rest of the drum set because I'm just going to use that to blend in the overall sound. We're going to move on to our snare drums. So a lot of times with the snare drum, you'll have a top and a bottom. Sometimes people do 2 tops and 1 bottom, or maybe a top, a side, a bottom. I don't traditionally do the side. Most of the time, I'll only ever have one mic on the top and one mic on the bottom. In this scenario, I'm using the Shure SM7. You'll see a lot of people use the SM57 on a snare, which is great. Sometimes I'll use the 57. But a lot of the times I'm using this SM7. I love the sound of this microphone on snare because it has a lot of rejection from the hi-hat. So since you're having the snare drum mic right on the snare, it's also right next to the hi-hat. So it can be really annoying when you're trying to EQ a snare drum to have a ton of hi-hat into the snare. It can kind of ruin your snare sound. So I love microphones that have pretty good rejection on them, and the SM7 has that. This I'll typically position facing the middle of the snare, and I'll usually use 3 fingers to kind of try to get it the height of it. And also what I love about the SM7, it has this recessed, it has this caging on the outside of the capsule. So that actually protects the mic from when the drummer, if the drummer were to hit it, it actually protects the capsule of the microphone. It also makes it so you don't get the capsule too close to the snare top. If you get the capsule too close, it can really affect the drum sound in a negative way. So I'll just traditionally get this sort of 3 fingers up and facing the middle of the snare. And again, this might very well change based on the way the actual drum sounds. So then on the bottom of the snare, the top snare is really going to be your crack, and it's really going to be the main source of the sound. But for the bottom, you actually have the snares of the actual snare drum. You're miking those because you can get a lot of high end and a lot of clarity to the snare drum. So like if a snare drum is really dark, instead of just reaching for the EQ, I might just bring up the bottom snare, and that will just add a little brightness and a little depth to the snare itself. So here I'm using the Beyerdynamic. It's a dynamic hypercardioid pattern microphone. It's the M201. This is a recent find. I love this microphone. Sometimes I'll use it on the top. What I like about it, since it's a hypercardioid, it's rejecting a lot of sound from behind it. So if I kind of point it to it with the null facing the kick drum, I get rejection from the batter of the kick drum, and I can really focus the sound of the bottom snare. So between these 2 microphones, what's really important and the classic thing to do is to flip the phase on the bottom snare or on the bottom mic so that they're not out of phase from each other, because this mic is pointing down and this mic is pointing up. Now, I see a lot of engineers flip the phase as a default for the bottom snare and then not necessarily check that phase. I think it's really important to check and listen for the phase, because sometimes, and I would say a lot of times, the phase actually, if I flip it, is not properly in phase. So I like to use my ears. I'll close my eyes and flip the phase until I like the way it sounds the best, and then that's how I use it. So definitely check that to make sure that it's actually in phase. And we'll talk about phase more once we're in the control room. So now you have your 2 snare mics. Now we're going to go to our hi-hat mic. You could use so many different hi-hat mics. This is an AKG C451, which is a classic microphone. It's great for overheads. It's also great on snare. If I'm doing a jazz record, I'll usually have this on my snare drum because it has great body but also really great high end. This has a negative 10 dB pad in it, which is great, so I don't have to do that on the console. And it depends on where I face it. If I'm looking for a lot of attack from the hi-hat, from the stick noise, the stick is going to hit it here, then I can point the capsule towards the stick and I'll get more attack. If I want more of an ambient hi-hat vibe, I might put the mic facing the outer rim of the hi-hat. But you have to be careful not to get it too close, because then you're going to get some woofy air sound, because when you close it, you're going to get air that comes out, and you don't want that to hit the capsule. So normally I'll kind of put it sort of in the middle, facing more for the attack of the stick, but also you can get some nice bleed from the snare, which can kind of open up the snare sound a little bit from the hi-hat. So again, I'm using all these microphones to blend together to get an overall image of the drum set. And so I'm not afraid of the bleed. I want to use the bleed to my advantage. So if this sounds great in the hi-hat and the snare is bleeding into it a little bit, maybe that works, and if it doesn't, we can adjust it later. And we're going to find out once Pablo starts playing. Then we move on to our toms. So here we have a rack tom and a floor tom. I've recently discovered these microphones, which I love. One of the biggest reasons I like these microphones is because of the way they're shaped. they're easily, you can put them above the toms really easily. I guess they're side address. So the capsule's on the side here facing down. So a lot of times with like 421s would be your classic, Sennheiser 421s would be your classic tom mics. They can be pointing, they'll be like at an angle pointing down. They're kind of hard to position over the tom to get a good sound. What I love about these is that you can position them right over the toms. They don't get in the drummer's way, and they're easy, and they sound good. These are actually condenser. Audio-Technica makes great mics. This is an Audio-Technica AE3000. I like the bleed from the cymbals into these. So in the Sennheiser 421s, the bleed from the cymbals I found to be a little bit harsh and a little bit annoying. So a lot of times I'm finding myself gating out or editing in Pro Tools. I'm editing out the sound between the tom hits, and that's kind of a pain in the ass. So what I want to do is integrate the bleed from the sound, from the cymbals into the sound, so I don't have to do that. So here, I like the actual bleed from the cymbals, them being condenser mics. I feel like they flatter the cymbals a lot more than you would if you put a 421. So with this one, I'll position it, again, about 3 fingers above the tom. And for these, I actually will point the null, because these are cardioid, to the crash cymbal for the rack tom, so that when he hits the crash, it's not overpowering this. So I'll put the null there and have it kind of pointing towards the center of the drum here. The same thing with the floor tom. I have it about 3 fingers above, pointing a little bit towards the center. And again, the null is going to the top. The null here is going to the ride cymbal and this other crash. I have the pad on these. I have a negative 10 dB pad, but the filter here is on 0 because I don't want to cut out too much of the low end. Also, you'll find a lot of times in drums, when the drummer's not playing the toms, these will actually vibrate, and you'll hear that a lot. And a lot of people find it undesirable. But I actually like it because it adds a natural character to the drums, as long as they're resonating in a way that's not out of tune with the song and they're not annoying. But if they're resonating while you're playing and it sounds natural, then I like to leave that because it adds a little vibe to the recording of the drums. And also, if they are out of tune with the song, the vibrating, you can tune the drums so that they work better in that way. So again, that's up to you. Here we have this little thing. The drummer, a lot of times will stick stuff all over the drums to make them sound a different way. He's been using this thing, which is I don't know. Recently he's gotten this, and that kind of deadens the snare, gives it a nice big sound. You can hear the difference. That's like very ringy and open. And you put this on, it makes it nice, low end, deep and big, and a little bit less ring. So that sounds awesome. This one we have like a little rag on it here. He's been recently using these little clips to put the rag on, and that just kind of deadens the sound a little bit. See, without it, it's kind of like a timpani vibe. And you put it on here, very subtle, but it really kills the drum. But it gives it a little bit more. It's a little tighter. So again, it depends on what you're looking for. The next microphones we have here are the overheads. So we have hi-hat overhead and a ride overhead. The reason I call them hi-hat overheads and ride overheads versus left and right is because if I record drums and I'm sending it to a different engineer to mix it, if I just write left and right, they're gonna have to figure out which side is the hi-hat and which side is the ride, which is really annoying as a mixer because it's just easier to know specifically where the mic was. So the reason I do hi-hat is because this one's above the hi-hat and then this one's over the ride. As far as the overheads are concerned, these are Beyerdynamic M160s. They're ribbon microphones. The reason these are awesome, well, one, because ribbons I love on overheads because they're less harsh and they do a lot of the work for you as far as taking out some of the high end so it's not harsh and brittle in your ears. And the other reason I love these microphones in particular is because they're hypercardioid, which means they reject a lot from the behind the mic capsule. So they're really focused in on the drums and not the room. And the reason I like that in this room in particular is because it's a really big live room, which means if I have like a set of Omnis or even a set of, like U67s or U87s or something like that, they can tend to be a little bit too roomy, particularly if I'm going to be using room mics. because then the whole sound is going to be washed out and too roomy, especially if it's going to be like a hard rock vibe. So for like a hard sort of like rock vibe, I want to make sure that I can have the option to make the drums more roomy or to keep the drums tighter. So if I do the hypercardioid on these, I am able to keep the rooms tighter. So sometimes for the chorus, if it's like a really tight groove, I'll take out the room mics, have a nice tight drum sound, and then for the chorus, let's say it's a big washy chorus, I'll bring in the room mics and make it nice and big, and then I can bring it tighter again. But I have that option if I use these as the overheads. Those would be kind of like your go-to standard microphones that you would want to use on drums. I always like to add extra mics for fun. One of the mics I love adding is the crotch mic. I call it the crotch mic. Other people like to call it the knee mic. I call it the crotch mic because it's more fun and it's pointing at the crotch of the drummer. This is a pretty standard thing. A lot of people do this, but everybody has their own technique. And honestly, my technique ranges depending on how I'm feeling that day. Normally, I'll use a ribbon microphone. Because I can squash it with a compressor later. I'll just squash the hell out of it, and it's really going to give you the body and the depth to the drum sound. So this is a Coles 4038. This is your classic ribbon microphone. This is a figure 8 pattern. So a lot of times ribbons are figure 8, which means it's picking up from the front here and from the rear. So what I love about this is that it gets the sort of body of the microphone. So we'll listen to that when we get back in the control room. With this, if you're using ribbons, you just want to be careful because most kick drums have a little air hole here at the top that when you kick it, the air goes out, and ribbons can be damaged from the air hole. If the air goes into the ribbon, it can break the ribbon. Ribbons are really delicate microphones. So I usually try to make sure to keep that away from the air hole. Now, we're going to our room mics. So here, I usually like to have a mono room mic. I find that sometimes the stereo room mics can lose focus of the drums or introduce some phasing issues. It can be fun to do stereo rooms. Recently, I've just been doing mono rooms. In this scenario, we're going to have one mono room and we're going to have some stereo rooms as well. This is the Neumann U67. This is the reissue copy. It's a tube microphone. It has variable pickups and it has a filter in it. I love the U67 on room mics. I think it has a beautiful quality, especially in this room. After, I'm constantly exploring different room mics, and this one is definitely my favorite so far. We'll see, Sometimes I use really lo-fi mics, sometimes I use really high quality mics, but this one so far has been really wonderful, and it's warm. You feel the warmth of it from the tube, which is really nice. I've been letting that sit there and warm up. So this one actually is in Omni. Omni means, and obviously you should know this, but whatever. Omni picks up from everywhere. So the pickup pattern is that it's picking up from all over the place rather than just a focused cardioid pattern. I'll put this in Omni so that it picks up a nice big room washy sound. And I've been putting it around this area recently, and it's been getting a really, really cool sound. Not too distant, but big enough that if I compress it, you can really bring the room out of it, but it still has a lot of depth to it. Then the last two microphones we're gonna talk about are the ceiling mics. Now, since we've moved into pinch, I've experimented with tons of different ceiling mics. I'll get up there on a ladder and I'll attach mics to the ceiling and I'll leave them there for a couple months. If I like them, I'll leave them. If I don't, I'll move them to different spots. I actually have 3 pairs of ceiling mics right now going. We have a pair behind this gobo here, behind this black gobo. There's a stereo pair of condensers in XY. And then we have this ceiling skylight mic, which is a really shitty lo-fi microphone, which sits in the skylight. That one I use if I want a really shitty, trashy sound. What I'm using today is we have these 2 PZM microphones, which are boundary microphones, meaning you attach them to a surface, and it takes the vibration of that surface and uses that. So they're really cool, vibey things. A lot of times people put a PZM mic on a kick drum or something like that. In this scenario, I don't know if you'll be able to see them, but I have a left-right PZM mic all the way on the actual wood beam of the building. So they're 2 little black things up there, and they're stuck to the left-right of those. So I'm going to use those 2 as my stereo pair, and I'm gonna squash the hell out of them with compression to really bring out the room and give me a length, that we'll look for, and a lot of times and we'll talk about that in the control room, I'll adjust the attack and release so that it pumps with the song. So again, we have 13 microphones. I'm using and I have a reason for every microphone. I have a reason for why I'm using each microphone, why they're condensers, why they're ribbons, why they're dynamic microphones, where they are specifically, and what I'm trying to achieve from those microphones. I may not end up using all these microphones if I go to mix, and maybe I just like the kick, snare, and overheads. I might just use those. But normally, I have a good vision of what I'm trying to accomplish. And for this particular setting, I want to show you a multi-mic setup just for the sake of the video. So now what we're going to do, I know this is very long-winded, but recording drums is a thing, and it takes a little bit of practice, and I like to explain things a lot. I like to hear myself talk too. Last thing I'll mention is I'm sending these ribbons through cloud lifters. If you come down here, these are the cloud lifters made by Cloud. And what they do is they take the ribbon mic and they boost the level so that because ribbon mics have really low level, so that you don't have to crank the mic pre, which introduces a lot of noise to the signal path. So this brings up the microphone level. These actually take phantom power. Traditionally, you're not gonna wanna send phantom power to a ribbon microphone because it'll damage it, but these protect that from phantom, and they bring up the signal so it's a nice clean signal. 9 times out of 10, I'll use these cloud lifters on all my ribbons because they really make using ribbons much easier and much safer, because I have exploded Coles, a set of Coles before, and had to send them back to England from doing phantom power to them. I unfortunately do that more often than I'd like. So I highly recommend the cloud lifters. All right, so now we're in the control room, and what I'm gonna do is go through the gear that we're gonna use to record Pablo. We'll go through the EQs, the compressors, the mic pre's, the type of console we're using, so on and so forth. Here at Pinch, we use an API 2448 console. We've had this console for about a year now, and it's actually a brand new console. This is a newly released version of the console that API has made. We actually had the first one in New York City, and it's been fantastic. It has a beautiful sound. It's really punchy. It's smooth. It has a lot of depth to it, great stereo image, and just everything about it has been fantastic. It's got really great workflow. It's an inline console, so we have small fader path, large fader path. It makes it really friendly for tracking sessions and also for mixing. So for the drums, we're gonna be using mainly all the API mic pre's, which come on the board. These are API 212 mic pre's. And we have 32 channels of that. The only other mic pre that we are going to be using is on the outside kick drum. We're going to be using solely the API mic pre's, which are well known for recording drums because of the quality of the punchiness. But for the outside kick drum, we're actually going to be using a Neve 1073, which we also have. We have a bunch of Neve 1073s here, which obviously are really well-known mic pre's, which are awesome. But for this scenario, we're using the API. They're just different colors. For the outside kick drum, I'm going to be using the Neve 1073. The reason I'm doing that is because for the outside kick and rock, I usually like to have a little bit of distortion on that kick drum, and I love the sound of the distortion that comes from the 1073, and we'll go through that as well. On the signal path, I typically, my technique for recording drums, and this is different for every engineer, is I like to record the compression. I like to record the EQ. If I'm doing any EQ or compression moves, I'm recording that to tape. I'm committing to it so that it sounds as good as possible when you play back. And I find it more fun than just getting a clean, transparent sound. I find it a lot more fun to mess with knobs. It allows me to turn more knobs. And at the end of the day, turning knobs is why we're here. You know what I mean? We like to turn knobs. So anyway, so I like to print all that stuff. So I'll come into the console, I'll use the mic pre's, and then I'll send on the small fader insert sends, I'll have various things going on. Typically, I'll use the console EQs unless I really want a different color. The console EQs are the API 550As. I have a couple custom EQs in here. I have the SSL 611 EQ here on channel 1. The reason I do that is because for my inside kick drum, which usually ends up being on channel 1, I really like to be able to sculpt the sound, and this gives me a lot of variety as far as being able to really get between frequencies where the API can't get to. So that's why I have that one there. I also have one here, the SSL 611 EQ here on channel 25, because if I'm tracking drums in the small booth, the kick drum usually comes up here on 25. So I have one there as well. Other than that, I'm mainly using all the API EQs except for the snare drum. The snare drum top, I'm going to send through the Pultec EQ. This is a highly sought after, really nice, beautiful tube EQ, which is a classic. These things sound amazing on pretty much anything you put them on, but for this scenario, I'm putting them on the top snare drum. As far as compression is concerned, you'll see here on the console I've laid out with the tape. It'll say the mic, kick in, kick out, snare top, snare bottom, so on and so forth. But I'll usually also put the signal flow. So it'll say which compressors I'm using, and if there's anything other than the board EQ or the board preamp, I'll put that as well. So you'll see here kick in says 1176, kick out says 1073, snare top says 1176. This way I know very easily when I put the insert in where it's going to. So we're going to be using the 1176 on the inside kick drum. We're going to be using the second 1176 on the top snare drum. We're going to be using the distressors, which are just insanely amazing, on the crotch mic, which is the most exciting mic. And let's see, where else are we going to be using them? I have it also on the room mic, the 67 room. We're going to be using the Neve 33609 compressors on the ceiling mics, which should be exciting. We'll see how that works. And let's see, what else we got? I mean, what's great is we have a lot of toys. You know, we just run shit through all kinds of stuff. And I like to use it because we have it here to be used. All right, so on the overheads, we're going to be running them through the Retro Revolver. This is a tube compressor, which is new actually. They just released this model a couple of months ago. It's a stereo compressor, and I like to use them on overheads because they add an interesting character, but they're not too compressed. So the compression element is somewhat transparent, but the coloration is very much present there. I think that's pretty much it. Oh, I think we're using the DBX 160 compressors on something, and that's my parallel squash bus, which we'll get into once we get into the recording of the drums. And that is also, the parallel squash bus is going through the Zulu, which is a passive analog tape simulator, which is a really cool product that has been recently, I mean, I guess it's been a couple of years, but this thing is really fun as a sort of lo-fi box or distortion box or just whatever. Just send some shit through there and see what happens. And then those are going through the Neve 1073s as well. That's a parallel squash bus, just for fun. One of the big things about recording drums, I always like to do something I've never done before for fun. That's how we discover things that work, things that don't work. Maybe this will sound like shit. I don't know. I haven't done it before, so we're going to try it. We'll see what happens. And we'll record it. I think it'll be cool. All right, so what we're going to do now is get Pablo in the room, and we're going to start actually listening to some stuff.